Thank you, Lascan Corla, and I would like to thank everybody who contributed to the debate. I would like to thank those deputies and the parties, Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin, who expressed their support for the bill, and the individual deputies who expressed their support as well. And I would also like to thank the deputies who have concerns about it and who are opposed to it as well for their contribution to the debate, because I think it has been very interesting, and I think it's very important that we do debate this issue, and I think that in the House here is where it should be debated as well. And I think Deputy Matthews' contribution is correct when you say, that we can talk about it in committees for long enough and we can have consultations for long enough, but there comes a time when we have to do something and that we have to take action. And I would be a bit concerned maybe that the government is awaiting the report of the joint committee and then going to have a further debate in the House here afterwards. So it seems to me that decisions will be long-fingered and pushed down the road before the famous term that's kicking the can down the road, which we've come to hear so much about over the last number of years. I think the purposes of this legislation is that the law should be able to be used as a deterrent and as a tool to change culture in society and change behaviour in society as well. The legislation had to be very simple and basic in terms of the criminal law, because it wouldn't have been possible to include the social measures that would be required to help people out of the sex trade or out of prostitution, to give them economic alternatives so that they'd be able to have a reasonable standard of living without being forced to sell themselves on the streets or on the internet or in brothels across the country. And I think that was a part that I tried to emphasise in my opening contribution, and I think that's something that I've tried to emphasise at all times. So that's why the legislation, as Deputy Dáil says, is simplistic and not the way to go. That's why the legislation had to be simple, and I think unfortunately she missed the purposes and the wider context of the bill in her contribution. I'd just like to address a couple of points that the Minister said in his contribution, particularly in relation to the report on the UNAIDS Advisory Group on HIV and sex work, where the Minister stated it was published in December 2011 and expressed concerns about the conflation of sex work and trafficking and the impact that failing to clearly distinguish between the two has on sex workers. Well, that report was published as the Minister has outlined, but there is a very clear disclaimer at the start of the report that not all of the members of the UNAIDS, all the UNAIDS advisors, were in agreement with the position being adopted within the report, and that and also the report is set very clearly in the context of looking at developing countries with very high level of AIDS and where and the protection of people in those societies. So I think that's very important to put that in context in relation to the UNAIDS advisory group on HIV and sex work. And the other aspect of it is that sex work or prostitution doesn't distinguish between trafficking and people who are forced into it through economic circumstances living here. When a man goes into a brothel in this country or cruises the street looking for a sex worker, he's not interested whether they're trafficked or not, and he's not going to distinguish between that. And prostitutes are working side by side in brothels that are trafficked and that are here, that are natives or whatever of the country. So trafficking leads into sex work, leads into trafficking and encourages trafficking. And I think that shows in the department's own figures between 2008 and 2011 that 134 people were trafficked into Ireland for sexual exploitation, and 32 of those were children that were exploited here. And that's only the figures that we know about. We don't know the true extent of it. And it is very true in all aspects of the sex industry. We just don't know the full extent of it. As has been outlined by some deputies in Sweden, they didn't know the full extent of prostitution before the law was implemented there. We don't know here. All we can have is the best guesstimates of the guards and of people involved in NGOs that are dealing with prostitutes all the time. So we don't have full figures as to what the true extent is and the full extent is of prostitution. But the very interesting thing, and the Minister went on to say in his contribution, that human trafficking for sexual exploitation are unacceptable, and in this jurisdiction the criminal law does not tolerate that either. But even though we know that the 134 people were trafficked here for sexual exploitation, not one person was convicted or charged with using a trafficked person for sexual exploitation. So clearly that shows that the system isn't working and hasn't worked. And I think that's something that in some way this legislation attempts to address. But even if this legislation was accepted and passed by the government, it cannot be looked as being a solution or happening in isolation. It has to be seen in the overall context, and resources would have to be put in to assist women out of the sex trade, assist women out of prostitution who want out of it, give them alternatives, training, economic means and resources so that they can provide for themselves and their families with an alternative. And unfortunately, although I'd love to see it, I don't think we can wait for the revolution to bring the economic justice across society so that there won't be any economic exploitation of women and they won't be forced into the sex trade. I'd love to see it, and it would be great to see that it would happen, because I think that would solve an awful lot of problems, but that's not going to happen now. So we need to be doing something at the moment, and we need to be acting. I'm not saying that this will eradicate prostitution completely. I think it would contribute to changing the circumstances and changing the culture that we have in our society here. And I think we can look, and we have examples of how it has worked. If you look at drink driving, where drink driving is now culturally completely unacceptable in our society, we haven't eradicated it. It still happens. People still get prosecuted, but it's culturally unacceptable, and that's becoming more and more so. You look at the smoking ban, where it has changed the culture as well, and it's been culturally unacceptable for people to smoke except out in the open air, and that has changed the culture in our society as well. So I think that's vitally important, and that's where the context that this bill and this campaign is looking at, is trying to change the culture as well. There has been some comment about how women in the sex trade in Sweden have been marginalised and made more dangerous and made less safe because of the introduction of the criminalisation of buyers of sex there. But it's interesting to note that from a report in The Independent in March this year, that in 2012, 40 women, mostly Romanians, who'd been probably trafficked into Sweden for the sex trade, they were sufficiently confident to be able to go into court and give evidence against the men who had exploited them because of the decriminalisation that has taken place there. So I think that is important. I'd just like to wrap up and finish just by reading a quote from a blog on the internet from a former sex worker. I think that is important and contributes, I think, to the debate. Rape has become part of the job, so much so that we don't really use the term rape. We don't have permission to. We might allude to it, but then it is ignored and the subject is changed. Many become desensitized to the pain of others, because if you acknowledge someone else's pain, you may have just to acknowledge your own. And we don't have anywhere to place or deal with that pain. So some bury it, some use substances to forget it, some disconnect from it, and unfortunately some accept it as a routine. And to go on to say then that the sex industry is both a cruel and disturbing place, run by criminals, and all efforts must be made to bring it to its knees. And the only way to do that is to cut off what makes it exist in the first place. Men who believe they have a right to buy other human beings. And I think that's important to look at. And I think in the context of a regularised industry, we see from Amsterdam that it doesn't work. It doesn't prevent trafficking. In fact, it encourages it. It doesn't prevent underage children being forced into prostitution. And there was so much concern in Amsterdam that they actually had to introduce a 21 years age limit for prostitutes to try and curb that. And there is evidence as well, the New Zealand model has been talked about, and there's evidence from New Zealand as well that children as young as 12 are being put into prostitution because the industry has been deregulated. And indeed, the plight of au pairs has been cited here as the fact that they're being exploited in our society here. We have very well developed labour laws. We have laws against exploitation. We have laws about payment of wages. We have laws about entitlement for workers. But yet we still see au pairs being exploited in this society. We see workers being exploited across this society. And we see that if we regularise prostitution and regularise the sex trade, it moves it away from enforcement, because there is no way that the enforcement will deal with the issues that women have to face in this society. So for that reason, I think we do need to go down this road, and we also need to put services in place and put resources in place to ensure that women have the economic alternative to prostitution. And while we're doing that, then we can work towards the revolution that Deputy Boyd Barrett hopes for, where we can have complete economic freedom for everybody.